Hello there. I want to revisit the image of the many-headed Hydra as a very useful representation of the false consciousness that humans find themselves in and that Gurdjieff described. And later perhaps I will go into Genesis and have a look at the story of the fall of man. Included here a very beautiful painting by John Sargent, an American painter who was classically trained in Europe, and he painted this in 1921, probably in response to the victory in the First World War. But I particularly like this painting, this representation of the Hydra, because it appears to come from the crotch of the man, the sexual energy. The sexual centre is the reconciling centre of the lower story in Gurdjieff's representation. Gurdjieff described in infinite detail how human beings no longer lived up to their capacity, and how and why exactly we were a fallen creature, a creature that had created a culture over hundreds or thousands of years that no longer reflected his real abilities. They had forgotten who they were. Gurdjieff's methods were aimed to restore the functioning of the man in the middle story, in the middle of the body. There is a center there, the solar plexus, the celiac plexus, but it is in the middle of the torso, and for a normal man, his identity should function from there. And once upon a time it did. But somehow the energy of the human being has at some point in history risen up to the higher story and created the many-headed Hydra, the fragmented self. And over time, the malfunctioning of that fragmented self has caused a terrifying deterioration in the middle story of the human being, meaning the functions that used to be good, the functions of an animal, has now deteriorated. And so human beings find themselves in a very dangerous situation where they're unable to go back or to go back down, and they are unable to proceed. And you see this in society. The sense of deterioration is everywhere. As I said, the energy has risen up. I think it must have been in response to some environmental threat that people were forced, some tribe somewhere was forced to activate some higher energies, which are actually energies from the higher story. There is a design within a man, and that design follows the architecture of the universe, the law of three. So each of the stories functions from three different centers, and in addition to that there are three stories in total for the complete design. Now at this point we come to a major problem, which is that most human beings are very unfamiliar with the taste of objective knowledge or objective truths, because they live in a very automated way. They don't quite know what's going on. They go through the motions. They're not sure what the sense and significance of life is. And the idea that there could be something really solid is like the idea that you could have a teacher that you trust with your life and that you do exactly what he says. These things, especially in the West, have disappeared. Now, I mentioned at the beginning the painter John Sargent, who was trained in quite a grueling way at the traditional and ancient schools of art in Europe. I suppose he must have had a teacher of art that forced him to work, but nowadays it's very rare. As the energy rose up, it did not form itself in a harmonious way according to the design of man, which is that the higher emotional center, and then the higher intellectual center, and then the entire upper story, and then the entire man is gradually developed. That did not happen. There was a rapid rising up of energy to grab some kind of functions from the upper story, and that eventually became the falsely crystallized false consciousness that human beings currently live in, which is represented by the many-headed hydras. Many-headed because on closer inspection, a person's view of life is very fragmented, and you're never the same for long. Gurdjieff went into this in a lot of detail, so I'm not going to do it here. And if we could imagine that the energy that is in all the hydras was instead in one being, then that would be the man. That would be the finalization of the design. But such evolution takes a great deal of time and gradual development, because the creature has to learn step by step these new aspects of its consciousness. And you can imagine a tribe in prehistoric times where one day, for whatever reason, somebody invents a bowl or decides to sing a song, and the tribe likes it, and then they adopt it into their culture, and then it's retained in their culture, and the young, the children, are taught it, and they have evolved, they have learned something new. It takes a lot of time for that to happen, and not only to happen inside an individual, but for a culture to be created on the basis of that individual's sense of reality, and then to be passed on to children. So you could see that with Jesus Christ, who brought into society a different sense of life that eventually took hold, and a culture was created based upon it. And you can see that culture painted on the inside of churches and cathedrals. What it means to be a Christian man. And that was taught to children, and in that way mankind evolved. Somewhere, somehow, the gradual process didn't occur, and the energy shot up rapidly, probably in response to a threat, and an individual or a tribe or a nation started to use the higher functions through the fragmented self. And we can assume that it worked, as the legacy is given to us. And I think we can understand that in nature, especially on this planet, with the ever-changing seasons and ever-changing threats, a harmonious development of man is really not the way things work. Challenges arise and people either sink or swim. They have to make a leap. And human beings made a leap. And we could even say that making a leap into a falsely crystallized false consciousness is in some way the ordinary course of things on this planet. A planet that doesn't really allow the peace required for a harmonious development. So we have to have compassion for the situation and not lose hope that something terrible has happened. Maybe it was the beginning of something, but now we have to become the real man. One of the main problems with reconstituting the man is that the energy of the Hydra has to go back down into the middle story. This is a bit like if a general of an army decides to make a retreat. A lot of people don't like doing that. It requires a lot of skill and wisdom and maturity to know the right time and know that you must retreat. You must retreat. Advance and retreat is simply part of your repertoire, and you know the time and the place to do it. Very few human beings know that. Their only way of living is advance. You see this all the time with politicians who refuse to back down and create further problems. And it may also have been that the rising up of their energy in response to a desperate threat entwined a certain high state of emotional energy into the fragmented self that resulted, because the false consciousness carries within it a lot of intense energy. Today in our society you can see extreme sports, extreme food, extreme this and extreme that. The false consciousness has started to enjoy this kind of intense emotion, putting sugar in all the food so it tastes bigger and brighter. It's become a bit of a monster. As Gurdjieff described, one of the most frightening aspects to this false consciousness is that it's become almost a sealed system. A sealed system. It's hard to speak to it in any way that is meaningful, because it just cycles around from one head to another, meaning from one mood to another. Always full of itself, very vain, insecure. The strange thing about the false consciousness is that inside itself, it does not have the existential stability. It does not feel comfortable because it is not rooted in the right way. Because it doesn't feel comfortable, it is always trying to exert its identity. It's always clinging on. It's quite desperate. That's how people are. They try to cling on to their life and their activities and justify themselves and add more emotional energy, because inside themselves they are not rooted in the right place, so they don't have the comfort of their natural identity. And this anxiety and frenetic activity, this self-calming, self-defending activity of the false consciousness makes it very hard to speak to. A mature soul may stand back and recognize that something has gone very badly wrong. Gurdjieff's methods of dealing with the false consciousness are to, first of all, to reconstruct and enter properly the real identity in the solar plexus. And that means you have to work with aim, according to your individual will. And the basis of his teaching and practice is about that, is to reconstitute and properly enter the identity in the middle of the torso, which means that you don't operate from your head anymore, but something inside your body is initiating your life, and you try to calm things down upstairs. That's the first part of Gurdjieff's teaching. Eventually, all the energy that is inside the heads of the Hydra has to settle back down into the middle story so that the real being can grow harmoniously, step by step, the higher emotional and higher intellectual centers. And if you read the books from the classical students of Gurdjieff, that's how they lived. That's what they did, and that's how they lived. And Gurdjieff helped them every step of the way.